start with, can I shut this?
Sure.
What's your earliest memory of flying? Tell me that story about your cousin.
When the stork, when the stork took me to Mama, quite a venture. My first memory of the flying was down in the field in back of our house when Uncle Zeke flew in with a yellow Piper Cub and kind of fascinated me, and he actually took me for a ride. Is that okay on the floor?
Yeah, just leave it.
He took me for a ride around the fields where we were working, and it really, really was a big thrill to me. And looking at the airplane and the panel, I thought, my God, you know, he's so smart to be able to do this, and it was kind of intimidating for, you know, and I was only about maybe 8, 10 years old at the time. So that was my first venture into the sky, and then I done that until 1969.
Now, somewhere around this time, I think it was 68 or 67, something terribly went wrong,
69.
and the plane went down.
69 in March 69.
What were you doing? Describe what happened that day.
Well, I was going out on a trip, to Kentucky, and I was coming back home.
By yourself?
By myself. I was alone in the airplane. Airplanes didn't have autopilot in that vintage airplane and stuff like that. So it was kind of a long night. But however, there was kind of a weather phenomenon, and we had a real deep low pressure area here in the East Coast, and it was foggy, overcast, the whole East Coast, going down to New Jersey. I want to believe that the first airport that would have been close to being above minimums, other than Bradley, was somewhere, I think, in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, or something along those lines.
How does low pressure affect flying? What's the problem?
Well, low pressure is just associated with bad weather.
Okay.
Okay. Like a hurricane, for example. In order to get, you know, the pressure gets down under 20, you know, 28, and the winds in it's a counterclockwise flow of air. So when it gets here off of the coast, you basically got the moist air coming in all the time, circulating and so forth and so on. And you know, it could either bring snow, it could bring tremendous rains in.
Is there actually a steering wheel, or is it a shift?
It's a yoke that when you move it to the left and right, the ailerons will deflect.
Okay.
Now you can also steer it with the brakes.
With the feet pedals?
The brakes, just the regular brake pedals.
Oh.
Put the brakes on. You notice that the curvature of the wing is much greatly improved here. So when you're coming in and you got these flaps on like this, it's allowing you to land slower because it's producing more lift on the end part of this wing.
When you take off, are they in the opposite position?
They're up at 15 degrees. That and the tail. The tail moves down. The tail goes down.
That's what steers it, Steve, is the back thing.
A swampy area.
So you were coming north?
I was going north, or runway 6, yeah.
Yeah.
And I landed in it, like I say, landed in a swamp. Remember sitting up in the seat of the airplane, and it was very, very quiet. And I reached for my cigarettes to have a cigarette that was on the co-pilot seat, and I found there was no co-pilot seat. I was sitting in the seat by itself.
Outside of
And
the plane?
the airplane fuselage was 10 feet over to the left side, and I could feel blood coming down my face because when I went out through the roof, it tore all my scalp up and subsequently ended up breaking my cervical spine. But I was just sitting there in the water. I can just remember being cold. It was because March. It was pretty chilly. And I got up and I started walking through the swamp. And there was a large, it was like an island sticking out into this little swamp. It was maybe, say, 40 feet high or whatever it was, which happened to be on the top of it was a tobacco field. And I slogged up that, I climbed up that thing and walked across, and I could see a house like in the middle of the field. So I went to the house and I banged on the door. And
what time of the day is this?
Pardon?
What time of the day is this?
This wasn't day. This was like 2 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, so you're knocking on somebody's house at 2
Yep,
o'clock?
at 2 o'clock in the morning. The lights come on, and this guy opens the door. Spanish guy opens the door, and I'm trying to explain to him that what went on, and he looked at me, and his wife looked over his shoulder, and then he slammed the door.
That was it?
Shut the lights off and all that. So I said, "Oh my gosh!" So I walked out. There was a driveway, and maybe could have been 1,000 feet driveway. And I walked down the driveway to the main road, and I got on the main road, and a state cop picked me up.
Oh my God.
And he happened to live very close by, so he took me home, and he laid me on the kitchen floor. I remember that, and I was laying on his kitchen floor, and my neck didn't hurt too bad, but it was starting to ache a little bit. And to find out later on that they were already looking for me from the time the airplane.
Because you must have been in radio contact. I'm coming in.
Well, I was,
approach.
but the radar, when it went off the radar, they knew something. You know, they knew I was where I was pretty close. They knew the position, the last
Where you last
blip that I had, you know, so they were already looking in that area for something. So I do remember the ambulance coming out, and they took me down to the Hartford Hospital. And I remember going to the emergency room and seeing all these doctors and nurses. There was like 20 or 30 of them. And I could kind of listen to what was going on, and it was, I don't know if it was relief or disappointment, because they thought an airliner crashed.
Oh.
And they were all queued up to
There's only one
take,
guy.
you know, all 50, 100 people and all this stuff, and then this one lonely guy comes in all bloodied up, and, you know, and it was almost like, you know,
That's all there is.
stuff like that. So
That's it, one guy.
yep. So that was that. When the guys call in, tell them there's a lot of freaking crows in the infield. I'm trying to chase them, but they don't want to freaking move. Somebody bitches. Okay? All right. Love you. Bye.
No, I just saw a documentary on these crows. They're smart as best.
Yes, they are. They're all back there again. They're smarter than me, that's for sure. See, they're getting used to it already.
The hell with him. Look at. Oh. You're not gonna win, Bill.
That's it a little bit.
They're in the trees now over here.
And out of the 3, 4 years that we had it, probably about 3 or 4 kids ever moved on to get their actual ratings. For example, one girl from the day she started dreamed about ending up with NASA, being a space pilot. Now, she ended up in NASA. I don't know if she ever got into space or not, but she did get to work for NASA. We had a couple of young kids who were really into it. They wanted to become airline pilots. And they did make it to the airline pilot. The majority of them just went through it kind of like a lark because it was being free. And, you know, it got down to a point where we had competitors with football, baseball, soccer. Everything that was going on in these schools were being done on Saturdays, just like we were. We were being done on Saturdays when the kids were out of school. The coaches would give the kids the options. Hey, if you want to fly, go fly. If you want to play baseball, you got to be here every day at this certain time, and so forth and so on. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's a hell of a choice to make for a kid that's between 10, 12 years old, you know, where your peers are playing baseball that you're with every day in a week and stuff like that, you know. And so, you know, it became a folly. To the fact is, I felt that, you know, a lot of money was being spent for, you know, it really was a waste of time. It was just a little hobby. When they got to want to do it, they did it, you know.
Right.
So when you ask me, you know, what does it take for a kid to want to be a private pilot? First of all, it really takes a deep desire. You have to sacrifice certain things to study work versus what your normal school work would be. And, you know, you have to weigh it basically on the side of the schoolwork, reading, writing, arithmetic first, and then the flying comes secondary. So that becomes, you know, after you're tired of doing your schoolwork, you got to, you know, dig in and start doing flying work, you know. And right now, it's expensive.
Yeah.
An average private pilot is $8,000 to $9,000, and then you have to go on to become a commercial pilot. You need 250 hours. And to become an airline pilot, you need a minimum of 1,500 hours, 1,500 hours. So, you know, you have to have the wherewithal to stay with it, become probably a flight instructor yourself to build up times that are required and so forth and so on, you know.
Yeah.
And that group is going down, and that's basically documented with AOPA, Aircraft Owners and Pilots Associations, that, you know, if you look back 15, 20 years ago, there was like 615,000 flight instructors. We're now in a country that are down to somewhere in the 200,000. So a lot of these kids aren't, you know, going along those courses to do it. So, you know, a lot of it's going to depend now, I suppose, on computers itself. A lot of the stuff is going to have to be done by the airlines themselves, starting to train kids right from day one, right up through getting in the cockpit of an airliner, because the expense for the average person, you know, is just going to be too overwhelming. So.
Well, the Air Force does it pretty quick. They hire kids they take kids right out of high school. You're 18, 19 years old,
Yeah, but
and you're flying
Don't
quick.
always become a pilot.
I have a kid right now, one of my ex-line guys that were working here, who's out in the Air Force Academy, and so far he's very brilliant, and he has tremendous knowledge of computers and cameras, which you're doing. He's taken some things around here I can probably show you later on that are just beyond the scale of a high school student, what he's done with filmography and so forth along those lines. But his deepest desire is to become a fighter pilot. And up to now, his eyes are at par what it takes to be a pilot. You need to have 20/20 vision, obviously. He's at the right size. He's not a big lad. He's probably 140, 50 pounds, 5'6", something like that, which is great for cockpits. And he's in the right environment to do it. He's checked with the people, the entrance people there, and they have told him, yes, you are up in the upper echelon of people, probably to be considered because of your overall performance. However, he's got to be in for 4 years, and he has to re-up for a minimum of another 4 years. That's 8 years out of your life. Now, what happens is with the Air Force, depending on quotas on what they need, if you're in the Air Force Academy and you wanted to fly a carrier airplane, you'd have to go into the Navy. So there's some kind of a method to change over your service. Now, again, if you're in the Navy, you probably have more shot at being a carrier pilot or a fighter pilot, only because the Air Force uses both fighters and tankers and the C-5As, the cargo carriers, and so forth and so on. So depending on any specific time in your career, depending on what they need, is probably what you're going to be sent for training. For example, I had a young lad down here who was in the Air Force, and he went into the Air Force and he wanted to be a fighter pilot. And at the time he come around, they needed people to fly tankers. And so he got sent to tanker school, and he flew tankers. Now, conversely, when he got out of the service, he walked right into the airlines, because he was accustomed to 4-engine jets, and the flying the jet airplanes themselves.
Right.
Where it's not as easy for a hot rod that comes off of a carrier, to go out and fly
And make a living at it.
Yeah, but I mean, to go out and after when it's over, even if he gets into the airlines later on, you got to imagine a guy flying around at 1,200, 1,500 miles an hour all the time, landing on a carrier wide open, and then flying an airliner back and forth from Bradley to Atlanta. they go crazy out of boredom, so they end up doing something else. But again, that said, when you talk about people wanting to learn to fly, my advice always was have a good secondary way to make a living. Because when you're a pilot and you're flying for 100% living, you've got some pretty strict medical quotients that you got to keep. If your eyes go bad, or if you get real bad diabetes and so forth and things like that, you're not going to be able to keep your first-class medical, and you're going to end up. There are some special medicals, but not for some of the things that they have, and you're going to end up without a license, without a medical. Without a medical, you can't fly.
Yeah.
So make sure you got something to fall back on that you want to do. What is the next thing in the world you want to do after flying? And be good at that, so that if in case something happens, or if you get laid off, you can transition right into your second most palatable job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
That's good, Bill.
Oh, real good.
That